Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about how to transcend grief and loss. Grief is obviously such a huge part of our lives. No one is able to escape it completely. And the pain of grief and loss can be quite acute and overwhelming at times. And so, our goal for this episode is to offer what we hope will be a helpful overview of the course's teachings on this topic, as well as to offer practical advice for anyone who is currently in the grieving process. So, Robert, just to get started here, we have Transcending Grief and Loss as the title of this episode, but they're really shades of the same thing. Grief is the emotion that comes with loss. Grief is the feeling that comes when we experience a loss. And so, as we get started here, do you want to say anything about this connection between grief and loss? Because the course pairs them quite a bit.
Well, there isn't too much to say, but as I've been looking through the references to grief and loss in the course, sometimes they're thrown in lists of different things. And you just kind of read past it all and it all kind of blurs together. But every time those words appear, the course knows exactly what it's doing, because very often you do see there's about 8 times where grief and loss appear together. And you can see in those places there is an awareness that grief is the emotional experience of loss.
Before we get into what the course has to say about transcending grief and loss, I want to read an excerpt from an essay from Sophia Pembling. And Sophia is a widow who lost her husband after 35 years of marriage. And she wrote this really honest piece in Psychology Today called Processing Grief When the Waves Hit. And in this episode, we're not talking exclusively about bereavement, but if grief is the experience that comes from loss, I think we all know that our biggest losses come from the loss of relationships. And because of that, Sophia's story will sound familiar to anyone who is in this kind of severe grief. And it's also a reminder to those who've been able to move past grief, what it's like to be back there. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs, but it's so powerful. And here it is. She says, as we get more experienced at living in grief, we have periods when the processing is just a gentle hum in the background. But eventually you wake up one day and bam, the grief breaks through again. This is my life now. If it needs to be done, I must do it. From mopping the kitchen floor to dealing with repairmen to paying the mortgage, yard work, so much yard work, dishes, laundry, rolling the trash can to the curb, everything. It's all me now. After 35 years, no more helpmate. Sometimes I just let it all drop. And feeding myself. I have a running joke of sad widow meals, peanut butter and jelly and tortilla chips. Once it was burnt Trader Joe's pot stickers. Whatever. I ate them. I've gone on dates and realized that this too is my life now, trying to connect with people, starting from scratch, not being known in that deep, soulful way of a long marriage. Everything is an experiment. I have no map. I am in uncharted territory. This is my life now, and I am lost. Someone offered to buy his truck the other day. No, not yet. It took me more than a year to throw out a bottle of olive oil he'd bought. I miss Tom terribly. His sense of humor, his responsibility, his hugs, his very particular take on things. But along with all of that, I miss my life, our life. It wasn't perfect, but it felt safe and comfortable and soulful and loving. And I assumed we would just continue rolling along into our old age together. Now things look sort of the same, but everything is different. This is my life now. But where am I? Who am I? What happened here? What do I do now? Someday, all of this processing will help me grow big enough to encompass both grief and joy in my life. I also hope that someday I'll figure out what the hell I'm doing. Now, I love that because, again, it's so honest. My mom was widowed at 49, and I feel like so much of her story is in that essay. We are just so bound up with the people that we love that when we lose those people, whether it's from a death or a breakup or whatever, it just feels like such a loss of our own identity. And it's so intense that sometimes we have to figure out who we are without them. You know, it's almost like what she's saying here. You have to relearn how to live in the world. And that's what comes along with a loss of that magnitude.
Yeah, well, we were talking earlier about our own kind of grief experiences, and I've had some major ones, but the one that comes to my mind is when my dad died, which was 20 years ago. And it was an odd thing because we weren't that close, but I went through a really intense time of like several weeks of just really being broken up and doing a lot of crying, and nothing helped at all. And it just kind of rolled through like a locomotive, and then it had passed. But during that time, it took over.
What Sophia is saying in her essay here about grief waves just feels so true. Anyone who's experienced true grief in their life knows what that means. It just comes out of the blue, completely takes you over, and then it moves on. And then it comes again and takes you over, and then it moves on. And it's so bizarre. I had them with the death of my grandmother. I had them with the breakup of my marriage. I had them with breakups of friendships. I mean, just whenever we experience this deep, soulful loss, it just feels like part of us dies too.
Yeah, and it's weird that it has such a life of its own, because that's not been really my experience with other kinds of emotion where they just take you over and there's nothing, it seems, you can do about it.
I know. I've experienced that kind of grief in my life where I've called it going back to the studs. Like if the loss is so acute that you feel like you have to completely start over. And what does your life look like from that point on? And so just really have a big heart for anyone who's going through any kind of experience like that right now. So let's get into what the course has to say about grief and loss, because that is, after all, what we're really here to talk about. In preparation for this episode, I was researching grief, and one of the things that came up the most is that the way to deal with grief and loss, and I'm talking here about the conventional point of view, the way to deal with grief and loss is to first, quote unquote, accept the reality of the loss. And this was really intriguing to you and I because the course teaches the exact opposite. So rather than accepting the reality of the loss, the course teaches that healing comes from realizing that loss is not real. So let's talk about that idea.
It couldn't be more directly opposite. And I think people who maybe have experience with, say, grief counseling, they may see the course's position as really naive and basically see it as amounting to denial. But I think that there's just a fundamental choice we face in terms of what is the real nature of reality. In the course's view, I mean, it teaches a very unconventional view of reality. In its view, For instance, lesson 284 in the workbook says loss is not loss when properly perceived. There is no grief with any cause at all. And then the text in chapter 8 says, but all loss comes only from your own misunderstanding. Loss of any kind is impossible. So that's the Course's view, not like of some isolated event like the death of someone. That's its view of reality. And if reality is such that we really do lose, somebody we were close to dies, they no longer exist, the relationship no longer exists. If that's what's real, then yeah, we have to go down that path where we just accept the reality of it and try to find our peace with it. But if reality has a different nature than what we think, and loss isn't real, that allows for a total healing of our grief if we can truly get in touch with reality.
Well, there's the rub, if we can really get in touch with it, because it's so hard to get in touch with that idea when we're not in deep grief and loss. But you and I both know, whenever you're going through some super painful, traumatic experience in your own life, these truths that come to you under normal conditions just completely bounce off. And
Yeah.
so when it comes to this idea of loss isn't real, it can sound naive and like a form of denial, because we live in a world where the loss does feel incredibly real.
Very real. Yeah. I remember when my dad died, I memorized this prayer from lesson 163, which is, there is no death, the Son of God is free. It was a long prayer at the end. It's about the unreality of death. And I prayed that, and I prayed that, and I prayed that. And it just didn't seem to reach my emotions, and people's expressions of condolence and cards didn't reach my emotions. It just felt real.
I know, like, you can get the idea in theory, but that person you love is not around anymore. And
Yeah.
that's the thing that you're missing. And I think that's the bridge that we need to cross. And we're going to get to this, but where it goes from you're just intensely missing this person in your life to recognizing that there is some healing comfort in the idea that loss isn't real.
Yeah, and we'll keep talking around this in different ways, because I think the whole challenge is actually having a true connection with and realization of the fact that true reality does not include loss. And so we're just going to keep talking about that. But one thing that comes to my mind at this point is I've heard a lot of near-death experiences that have this interesting combination of ideas, which is people, experience leaving their body, and so often, like routinely, see that this is not real here. That, the separation, the being encased in a body that dies, and, being subject to time and space, they see that none of that's real. But I've heard so many of them say, and I guess this is somehow maybe revealed to them on the other side, but they say that the awareness that this is just a game, just a dream, is veiled while we're in the body. And I've heard them say, at least many of them, that it has to be veiled, because if we knew how unreal it was, we just wouldn't have investment. We wouldn't even play the game. We wouldn't learn our lessons. But what's interesting about the Course is it's saying all that same stuff, except it's our job here to do the work, to walk along a path and slowly, progressively realize the unreality of this, while still staying invested, while still reaching out to other people, trying to make the world a better place. And so I don't know what to do with that difference between NDEs and the Course, but the Course is saying something a little different. Yeah, it seems very, very real here. And yet it's our task to slowly walk up the mountain to the realization that we are not subject to the losses that seem to happen in the world of form.
Well, that's where NDEs can be really interesting, because you don't have to just take the course at its word that life goes on after death. There are tons of people who have no exposure to, interest in, or belief in the course who are having their own experiences about life transcending death.
Yeah,
And so
millions of people.
it makes perfect sense that we're not told the full picture here, but it also makes sense that we shouldn't believe that what we see is the only thing that's going on here. Yeah, I remember a few years ago for my birthday, you gave me a present that was an hour with a medium. And I am convinced that he talked to my grandmother because he said things that only somebody at her funeral would know. It was super private things between her and I that I shared at the funeral, but that was it. And I haven't had the opportunity to talk about that with anyone. So like, it's not anything that's on the internet, in other words. But it's not just mediums. People have their own experience of communicating with deceased loved ones all the time. They sense a presence, they have a smell, they see their visions, precognition. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about communication with loved ones after death. And there's so much of it that if scientists studied it in any kind of real meaningful way, I think we would all come to a view that's more course-like.
I think so too. And you were encountering, I saw the same stuff that you saw online where like grief psychologists were saying, yeah, it's just the workings of the brain. The brain just coughs up these hallucinatory experiences of deceased spouses, someone a wife or husband you've lost, all explainable. I think that's way too facile. I think that, serious investigation into what are totally normal experiences that people have, especially widows and widowers of their deceased spouse. There's a realness to them. Sometimes there's an evidential quality to them, something that cannot be explained as a mere hallucination. And, studies I've seen for 50 years now suggest about 40% of people who have been widowed will have something they regard as an experience of their deceased spouse. And oftentimes it's not just a dream. It's not just little coincidences that they, think is their spouse. It's like they see them, they hear them. And so I think this is a normal part of life that can really, really help us. And that sends us down that other path where we heal from grief by realizing the loss was not ultimately real, rather than we heal from grief by saying, that's how reality works. I had a real loss. I have to make my peace with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like there's the consciousness that creates the brain, not the other way around. And so when the brain dies, there are so many examples of how the consciousness continues, but again, the scientific community won't touch it. And so because of that, you and I kind of joke that it's halting the advancement of civilization, because if science would gather around this, then we would have a whole new view of life and of death that could bring a lot of comfort in this idea that we survive death, we go on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
huge thing. That's why we had Jeffrey Mishlove on and Sharon Rowlett, because there's real evidence out there. It's just that the reigning worldview says, well, that evidence can't be so.
Anyone who's interested in that evidence should listen to those podcasts. We did an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove and Sharon Rowlett, and those are available on our YouTube channel and in our podcast. So getting back to the course, there are many passages in the course about healing, grief, and loss. And the passages tend to focus on two things. One, the way that we transcend grief and loss is through the realization of who we are, meaning the realization of our holiness and the completeness of our true identity as God created us, and also transcending grief and loss by realizing that God didn't create sin, pain, and death. And so therefore, those things aren't ultimately real. So there's a lot there to unpack. So let's begin with the idea that we can transcend grief and loss by the realization of who we are in our true identity.
It is interesting to go through all these passages because you see certain themes recur again and again. And like you say, one of them is we need to go through a process of identifying with the eternally deathless, holy, complete identity that is our real identity. It doesn't seem to be our identity in this world. But here's another thing that people who have near-death experiences experience. They experience an identity that is indestructible and eternal. So if that's who we are, then our real nature is incapable of loss. If we therefore can identify with that true nature, then we wouldn't experience loss. And obviously, it's a very, very high thing in this world. We were trading stories that we'd heard of spiritual masters whose spouse had died and they were in profound grief. We really feel that connection, and it feels, in some cases, and it feels ripped away. But
can I just share the one that we were talking about earlier?
Sure.
I love this, where the guru, I forget which one, experienced the loss, I think it was of a spouse, and his followers came to him and said, "Why are you crying? Death is an illusion." And he said, "Because I'm sad." I love the realness of that, because we can understand that pain ultimately isn't real, suffering ultimately isn't real, death, all of it isn't real on the level of God's reality, but we still feel it here on the level of form. And I don't want us to feel like we can't acknowledge that, because it does hurt.
Yeah, and yet while we acknowledge that, we have to acknowledge the other side, which is we're heading up a mountain. The further you get up that mountain, the more you realize that who you are is deathless and complete and can never experience loss. And the more you realize that, the more immune you are to the experience of it. So it's just let's face it, let's not have a superficial view where you get it and tomorrow you're immune to all experience of loss. At the same time, that is the path, the ultimate pathway out of grief and loss and the other things we experience. Okay, so the next thing is about God. And the passages about grief and loss continually talk about God, and both how God created reality, but also God's will for us now. The Course again and again says that God's will is that we have everything and that we experience no loss. So it's both our true nature and God's will for us. And there's a great passage in the workbook in lesson 99 where it says, "Unshaken does the Holy Spirit look on what you see, on sin and pain and death, on grief and separation, and on loss." So he gets that grief and separation and loss all go together. Yet does he know one thing must still be true. God still is love, and this is not his will. So the Holy Spirit looks on all those things that normally we're told, yeah, they're just God's will. And he says, no, this is not his will. And I love that.
I know you love it, because you've been really trying to drill into my head as we've been preparing for this podcast that there are actually two subpoints here. One is that God didn't create death, and so it isn't real. And that's the one I've been focused on. But you're like, and it's not God's will that there be death. And there's something really healing in both of these, but there is something particularly healing in it, thinking about death as and loss and pain and suffering as not being God's will. So it's not only that he just didn't create it, it's that he doesn't want it for us. And so often, you were pointing out that when something bad happens to us in this world, someone will say, well, it must have been God's will, or God's will is a mystery. And there is something really comforting as course students in being able to know, well, actually, it isn't God's will. So I find that distinction to be worth pointing out as well. I know it's a issue for you.
Yeah. I mean, we do reach for, well, so and so died. It was God's will. And that means I'll just make my peace with it because it was God's will. And what the Course is saying is it was not God's will. And what's not stated there, but implied, because this is the Course, is that only what God wills is real. So that it was not God's will, therefore it was not real. Therefore, I'm not really subject to it. And I love it when something that we all just take for granted is questioned so completely and directly. Let's find comfort in the fact that it's not God's will.
Yeah, he doesn't want that for you. And because he doesn't want that for you, it's not part of your ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if God is love, then of course that would be true. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing interesting about these two themes, that, your true identity is incapable of loss, and God's will for you is the opposite of loss. He wills you to have everything. You see those combined a lot in the Course. And so I just wanted to read a passage. This is from Review 1 in the workbook. But you see both of these things in there. So it says lesson 58, and it says, I cannot suffer any loss or deprivation or pain because of who I am. So there's the first theme. Then it says, my Father supports me, protects me, and directs me in all things. His care for me is infinite and is with me forever. There's the second thing. So if we're really wanting to transcend grief and loss, we need to slowly hike ourselves up that mountain where we more and more identify with and get in touch with those two themes. I can't suffer loss because of who I am, and God's care for me is infinite and is with me forever.
You and I hosted a workshop not too long ago on death. And one of the things that we emphasized in that workshop is that the other person did not die, that the relationship is still intact, and that communication can still take place. And the Course talks about this, and in a really compelling quote, it says that demonstrating that communication remains even after death is a reason that Jesus was born. So the Course says in chapter 15 that Jesus was born to, quote, reestablish the condition of love by teaching that communication remains unbroken, even if the body is destroyed, provided that you see not the body as the necessary means of communication. What a really interesting idea. Not only that we can continue to communicate, that it all remains intact, but that was one of the reasons why Jesus was born, was to demonstrate or prove that idea was true.
Well, it's so interesting because, he proved that by remaining in communication with his followers after his body was destroyed. So you have this odd paradox here of him saying, I was born to demonstrate that communication remains unbroken even once my body was destroyed. I was born for something that happened after my life was over. But one of the things that scholars are quite certain of is that his followers did have experiences of him. It's just that if you're a scholar who is a more typical, academic, you're going to think, well, they hallucinated. I have an interesting book by a scholar who is he has some interesting beliefs, but he's more sympathetic to the reality of the experiences that Jesus's followers had of him, because he and his family have had their own ghost experiences, their own experiences of, post-mortem contact. So it depends on what you think. But the story, of course, is that after Jesus's body was gone, he kept in touch, and that was meant to prove something about the nature of life. And I think it's a powerful and important lesson.
That's one of the things that I found so interesting about Jeffrey Mishlov's argument in the podcast that we did with him, because he was basically saying that if you have a couple of instances of these kind of phenomena where people feel like they can communicate with others after their death, then those stories individually would be easy to disprove. But he had what he called the broken arrow theory, where if you put one arrow, you can break one arrow, but if you've got a collection of arrows, they're really hard to break. And we just have countless stories of people who are able to do this. And so it's not just Jesus, right? Like
Right.
there's so many other stories.
And that's why, excuse me for breaking in, but that's why it's so interesting that this scholar, I mean, some of the experiences, if I remember correctly, that he relates had a physical component to them. Deceased people showing up in some solid way. When that happens to you, you look at the stories in the New Testament and you think, well, it's more of the same. It's not a unique thing. It's kind of how life works.
And so you were saying before that there are naturally going to be people who hear this idea from the Course that there's no such thing as loss or death or even grief or pain, and say, that's denial, that's naive, etc. But if you really understand the idea in the big picture, you can see that it does have a truly beautiful healing quality to it.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead, but
ahead.
I want to say more about that. So should I
Well,
wait for you to finish your thought here?
no, I was done. I'm just trying to appreciate both sides, because I will never see my grandmother again, and she was my favorite person in the world. We know what it's like to experience the loss of something in form, and yet it is truly healing to think that they're still around, and life goes on. So it
Yeah,
can be healing.
it can be profoundly healing. I mean, if loss really isn't real, we have the way to heal from it completely. If loss really is real, then I feel like we can't heal all the way. Something in us kind of dies, and as we accept the loss that happened. And I think that it's very easy to say, well, of course, thinking that loss isn't ultimately real is pie in the sky, it's denial, it's wishful thinking. But do we really know the ultimate nature of reality? Couldn't our culture's current picture of reality not be where we're going to land in the end? Isn't there maybe evidence that there's a whole other view of reality? It's not a light matter. It's not something we can just say, well, it's all hallucination. And to continue what you're saying about its healing, one of the things we had in that workshop on death is we had a guest, which is not that common for us in workshops, Bryan Smith, who does the podcast From Grief to Growth. He is also one of the speakers at the IANS conference, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, coming up very shortly. And Bryan does grief counseling. He had a life-changing event happen in his own life where his daughter died, and he went through this huge process of seeking healing from that. And what was so interesting to me when we had Bryan on, people really appreciated the things he had to say. Like, we were asking him, well, how do you counsel people to get past grief? And basically what he said was it comes down to really accepting the unreality of death. Like, just that intellectual acceptance and then letting that sink in and become an emotional acceptance is how he helps people heal from grief. So the idea that loss is not real, that death is not real, we shouldn't denigrate that either as obviously not true or as it's just a head trip. There's power in that we need if we're trying to get past our grief.
The Course has a process for healing grief that's outlined in lesson 284. That lesson is, I can elect to change all thoughts that hurt. And it begins with some lines that will sound very familiar by now. It says, loss is not loss when properly perceived. Pain is impossible. There is no grief with any cause at all. Now, as we've been saying, we really understand that the idea of pain being impossible and loss not being loss is really difficult for us to grasp because we're so emotionally attached to what we've lost. But this lesson does give us that bridge. It gives us a way to get from where we start, which is that the pain is all consuming, to this very healing place that you've just described and that Bryan has experienced after the loss of his own daughter. So here's the quote from Workbook Lesson 284. And if you listen carefully, well, here's a quote from Lesson 284. And if you listen carefully to it, you'll catch a 5-stage process to what we're talking about. So here's the quote. It says, such is the truth, at first to be but said, and then repeated many times, next to be accepted as partly true with many reservations, and then to be considered seriously more and more, and finally accepted as the truth. So those are the 5 stages outlined in Workbook Lesson 284. Let's talk about them one by one.
Yeah, because this is a process, and it acknowledges that just like, okay, I accept in theory that loss is not real, is not enough. We need to be penetrating into that reality so that it becomes a real conviction and a real experience before we can count on it to heal some of the, overpowering grief that we experience. So at first, he says, at first to be but said. And that means you repeat the idea. And lesson 284, the idea is I can elect to change all thoughts that hurt. So the first thing you do is you just say it. And then he says, then repeated many times. And when he says many times, that's an understatement. He's wanting us to repeat these lessons, the idea in the lesson again and again and again and again throughout each day. And then he says, then accepted as but partly true with many reservations. And I think we know that feeling. Like there are times when we can think, I can't elect to change all thoughts that hurt. And other times where it's like, no, I can't here. This just hurts. The fourth thing is seriously considered more and more. That's where we're like, maybe it's true that I can elect to change all thoughts without exception that hurt. And then the fifth stage is accept it as the truth. And when you're at that place, the implication is when you really accept that as the truth, then you're beyond the experience of hurt, which obviously is an extremely high spiritual attainment, very, very rare, but that's the final stage that we're heading towards. And what I want to say is I've looked at this over the years. This was first pointed out to me by my old teaching partner, Alan Watson. The 5 stages is like, once he said it, was like, well, yeah, there are 5 stages there. But you can see there's 2 overlapping processes that are being described. One is you're practicing the idea. You're saying it, you're repeating it, you're repeating it, you're repeating it. And then the other is as you keep practicing it, it's starting to sink in more and more so that you're thinking, hey, that's feeling kind of true. Then you're thinking, that's feeling like it may be really true. And then finally, you have fully 100% accepted it as the truth. So the idea is through that practice and repetition, it's slowly internalized to become a total conviction.
I love this idea because it just feels so true. And it's so incremental. The course's path is so incremental. It really wants us to be doing these kinds of repetitions throughout the day with our practice. And what we learn is that over time, those little repetitions do build to a stronger mind. It's just like you do repetitions with bicep, your bicep curls makes your bicep stronger. Well, the repetitions of your practice makes your mind stronger, except what you're doing with your mind is you're training yourself to see another reality. And so the same idea that works with your body, you're training your physical muscles to be stronger through these individual repetitions. The same thing is going on with your mind. You're doing the repetition of your practice to train your mind to see another reality. And that's how the course works. We get there slowly. And I'm always saying this, so forgive me for those who've heard this again, but we accept this as true in every other aspect of our lives. We accept that we need to put in the practice to become good at something. But when it comes to spirituality, we think it's just supposed to be handed to us. We think we're just supposed to kind of snap our fingers and be enlightened. And what he's saying here, as he's saying throughout the course, is it doesn't really work that way, at least not in the course's practice. And so for anybody who's thinking, what is it that I'm supposed to do to transcend my grief and my loss? Well, this is the formula that he gives you. The only problem is it's going to be really hard to do it when you're in that state of acute grief. You're not going to want to do it, just as you don't want to do it when things are quote unquote normal,
Yeah,
So,
I think that we'd be tempted to say those truths are empty, they're just bouncing off, they don't mean anything to me. And sure, that's how it's going to feel, but there's a process. As we repeat anything, it becomes more real to us. Anything we want to learn, if we really want to learn it, we'll repeat it. My daughter just got her A-level results today. Huge thing in England, your A-levels. And
she did amazing.
She did amazingly. And the
Straight
amount
A's.
of repetition, that she did was incredible, because that's how you learn. And we learn all kinds of negative things that way. If we repeat constant self-criticism, how do we end up feeling about ourselves? If we repeat constant worries in our minds, how do we feel about the future? So repetition is a powerful, powerful thing. And the first 100 times you repeat this, it may just bounce off. But if you keep at it, just like with any repetition in life, it will start sinking in more and more.
There's an old quote from John F. Kennedy that is, you fix the roof when the sun is shining. And I think that idea applies here as well. You do your practice when your life is in a, again, quote unquote, normal place. And then when the rug gets pulled out from underneath you, you know that it works. And so if you have some deep loss, and then all of a sudden you have to try and convince yourself to do this practice, you're not going to want to do it. The muscle's too weak.
Yeah.
But if you have been doing your practice and you can see all of the ways in which it's helped you, all the ways in which you handled that situation differently because of the mental repetition, then you're going to have that trust there to lean on when everything falls apart.
I know we're drawing near the end here, but I've always been so inspired by the story of Brother Lawrence. And Brother Lawrence was the 17th century, I think, French monk. And some of his writings were collected together into the spiritual classic that we now call The Practice of the Presence of God. And Brother Lawrence, he did this practice of constantly reminding himself that God was with him, God was in him, God was around him in all those different forms. He worked in the kitchen for a lot of years. And he said he had 10 years of difficulty with that practice. And then after 10 years of just reminding himself all the time that God was with him, around him, in him, etc., it just blossomed. And then after that, he was just constantly, in his experience, he felt bathed in the presence of God. And one of the things that's so memorable about him talking about, where he got to, is he said, when for a while he would forget that God was with him, he said God would remind him with such delicious stirrings within him that he was embarrassed to speak of it. So you put in those years of repetition, and hopefully you get to where Brother Lawrence got.
Well, I have something very similar to that that I'll just share very briefly. You and I are morning meditators. You're a better meditator than I am. When we're not together, I'm shaky on my practice, and when we are together, I'm not as focused as you are in the work. However, I am a dedicated student. I'm a good soldier. And so I sit and do the meditation every day. And I stick with the time in part because it's our time. Like, I'm not going to let you down by ending early, but I stick with it. And even when I can't get there anywhere in meditation, I still stick with it. And yesterday, I was leading a meditation for the UK Miracle Network. And I always do better when I'm meditating in a group. I just think there's something about the group, the power of the group collective that just really makes my meditation stronger, way stronger than I can ever do on my own, it seems. And in that meditation, I had the most amazing experience. So I felt like I got some guidance that was really beneficial to you and we just couldn't stop talking about it. And it's one of those things that I will remember. And
It was really out of the blue.
it's really out of the blue. And my point is that you just kind of stick with it. And even when you feel like I'm not getting anywhere, then you do. Something happens, that stirring, that Brother Lawrence, something happens and you know that it's real. And so I say all of that to say this: don't give up. Don't give up, because all of those little repetitions matter. No effort is wasted, and they can lead to something that's really beneficial for you in the end.
Yeah. And just to sort of get closer to the end of our themes here, meditation is one of the themes in the course about getting past grief. There's a great line in lesson 41 where basically he says, deep within you is everything that is perfect, ready to radiate through you and out into the world. It will cure all sickness and pain and loss and so on. And the idea is that if you can contact the light of God in you, then that experience convinces you that loss is not real. So that's another part. Like, part of the practice here is repeating these statements again and again and again and again, which we should not discount, as we've been saying. But part of the practice is letting go of the words and sinking deep down into our mind to contact the light of God within us, which experientially shows us that loss is not real.
Okay. So just as we close here, we're getting to the top of the hour. The course has a number of places where it talks about how we can heal the grief and loss that others carry. But as always with the course, what it says isn't what we'd expect. So we might think, listening to this podcast, that we go out into the world and tell others that loss isn't real. But that's not the prescription that the course is giving us. So let's talk about how the course suggests that we go out and try and help others who are experiencing their own senses of grief and loss.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's one of those themes that you would not notice probably unless you collected all this stuff together in one place where grief is mentioned and loss is mentioned. But there's about 5 places I found that said different versions of the same thing. And that was, if you can contact the peace of God within yourself, then you can carry that peace just in your presence. And then bringing that peace as something that is authentic within you, emanates from you, is there between your words and within your actions and all that. That's how you can heal grief in others. And there's even a suggestion of like one of the passages is what I just mentioned from lesson 41. I don't think I actually have the quote here, but the idea there is if you contact that in meditation, it will radiate through you and out into the world. Lesson 245 says, I give your peace. This is a prayer to God, to those who suffer pain or grieve for loss. In Helen's final scribing, The Gifts of God, it talks about opening the secret place in you where God is plain as day, but you've hidden that place. And if you could open that secret place, it says you could relieve the world's grief and heal its pain and let the peace of God envelop it, as does a mother rock a tired child until it sighs and slips away to rest. So if we know somebody who is dealing with grief, if they're a fellow course student and are open to these teachings, great. Okay. Because otherwise there'd be no point for us doing this podcast. If you never say anything about this to anybody, then why are we doing this? But for the most part, people are not open to these teachings. And what they need from you is for you to do it yourself. We've been talking throughout this whole time about making real contact with a reality in which there is no loss. And what these different passages are saying is for you to make that real contact and for you to experience the peace of God that comes along with that is the basis for you being a healer of grief and loss in the world. Be that presence that just silently says, there is no loss. The peace of God is ours. And bring that into their lives rather than focusing on just preaching at them like, well, loss is not real. Like that's probably going to be counterproductive for the majority of people, right?
I know, because grief is characterized by such intense emotion. And sometimes when you're deep in it, you are borderline, if not fully, non-functional. And so that's not the time as course students for us to sweep in and start making these big metaphysical statements that could do more harm than good under those circumstances. But at the same time, this is where, again, we fix the roof while the sun is shining, because if we can fully let in these ideas now, we will strengthen them within us to call upon when we need it. And we can be that presence, just the presence of healing to those who need it. And we can demonstrate through our behavior that there is no loss, that we can show up and be caring and compassionate to the person who needs it, but we can also see the bigger picture and trust that they feel that too. Yeah. Robert, is there anything else that you want to say before we close?
Well, I think our main point we've kind of said again and again, but I think that just to sort of summarize what the Course is talking about, we tend to think, I've got this one instance of grief. How can I overcome this one thing? And yeah, we should try to overcome that one thing. And there is value, tremendous value in having experiences, not, having faith that my loved one still goes on, the relationship still goes on, but also having experiences of contact. Those are reported to be tremendously healing for someone who is in bereavement. But beyond, we shouldn't think in terms of, I'm going to heal that one instance of grief. Life is full of grief. We're losing things all the time, right? And experiencing little bits of grief. And the Course's prescription is we set ourselves on a path in which we do the work, we do the practice in different forms, whether it's, verbal or nonverbal, and we progressively enter into more and more conviction about and more contact with a reality in which there is no loss. That's like the long-term big solution for every form of grief, rather than thinking, well, how do I heal this one instance of it?
Gosh, there the Course goes again with its totally different reframes on everything. Because when you look up grief work, as you and I did in preparation for this podcast, again, the advice that you get is completely different. The advice that you get is, here are all the ways to accept the reality of your loss. And the course comes along and says, actually, here are all these ways to accept the unreality of your loss. And I just think that's so beautiful. And in the end, that's such a more healing message. I want to think that my grandmother and everyone else that I've lost, and everyone here who's lost a loved one, their loved ones are just going on and still living, and that communication channel can remain open, and that we will see them again.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'll just say before we close that the thing that came in my meditation, I imagine there's some people who are wondering, maybe not, but
no one's wondering.
If you are wondering, I'll just go to Jared. And this isn't part of the course, but it does ring that bell of truth. I was really thinking deeply about what is, when you really, really love someone in this life, like what happens to that? God, I'm gonna get emotional. Like, what happens to that love when they die? Like, where does it go? Why am I crying? But the thing that came was, get the relationship right in this life. Be as bonded and as strong together as you can possibly be, like two people can possibly be. Like, do the work to get it as solid and as healed as you can, as close as you can, as joined as you can. And the more you do that here, the better your chance of meeting again on the other side. And I just thought, wow, what an amazing thing, because that gives us something to do here. Like, it's not some like random universe where maybe like traffic, you just run into people that you love, but like you get your relationship right here, and you increase your odds that you'll be together again. And that's so cool.
Yeah.
Not in the course, but in my meditation. So hope that's helpful. I hope that that's as helpful to others as it has been for me. With that, we will close our podcast recording. For those of you who want to join us for live broadcast recordings of Exploring A Course in Miracles, we do these every Thursday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern, and then we have an optional discussion time for 30 minutes afterwards. You can sign up. It's free at community.circleofa.org, and we hope to see you in the community soon. Thanks so much for listening, and bye for now.